I may be a grown man, but on these dark, moonless nights, I freeze up something awful. I'll tell you why. I used to work hewing in the Dogwood mines. I worked there when it was a gold mine owned by Hartman Fitz. I still work there when it became an iron mine and was sold to Billings Mining Company. About half of the men that surrounded me in the first 2 years of the operation, the ones I grew to be close with, were replaced with men who could hardly speak English. Spaniards and Irishmen and Chinamen. In addition, all our wages were cut in half. We original miners, of course, gave the new boys hell. I suppose it was all we felt we could do. Our new foreman did favors for nobody. If you wanted something from him, you had to grease his palms first. He spent what money he had quickly and was always thirsty for more. He went by Big Tom, insisted on being called nothing else. He was a large man, but there was a Mick named Oyson who was taller. Big Tom was tougher on him than anyone else. We followed the vein of iron for about 3 months, when an adit, which was necessary for the drainage of the water that constantly gathered in the mine, collapsed. Our foreman insisted that we weren't producing enough iron for our shipments as it was, so a further delay from clearing the collapse or digging a new one could put us all out of our jobs. A downcast into the lowest level was also out of the question. I suppose now I should mention that none of us were hurt in the collapse. But water pooled at our feet. It was up to our knees when I struck into something odd. At first, by the give that I felt with my pick, I suspected that I had struck dirt. Then I brought a lantern up to my mark, and we stared together at the blood pouring from the hole. Clearing more rock revealed a wall of pink flesh, which we did our best to keep intact, but the flesh was connected. It was intimate with the rock. Doing so much as peeling the rock too quickly from the skin would tear it, releasing more blood and polluting the water in which we stood. As could be expected, Big Tom did not believe us at first, though the fact that we were covered in blood was alarming to him. He ordered all of the hewers out of the mine and did a head count. Seeing that all were present, he gave me a knife and told me to prove what I said was fact. Cutting into the thing was tough, like cutting rope. Though close to the skin, the flesh wall was bumpy, like a giant tumor of some sort. The meat itself resembled sirloin. I cut out a chunk of the meat, about twice the size of my thumb, and brought it back to the foreman. He turned it over in his hand, examining it. When I say the flesh was pink, I mean very pink, like the inside of a mouth, and about that soft. Then he told us to clear the collapsed adit, and that then he would take a look for himself. We trudged through the water and blood, which in some areas came clean up to our hips. The smell of the blood and wet clothing still follows me now, I think. Mike Kristoff, who was a good friend of mine, tripped and fell. He completely submerged himself and came back up, spitting it out and coughing. It took us the rest of the day and almost all of the next to clear and reconstruct the adit, which mercifully drained the bottom level. Big Tom still elected to come down the shaft to spare himself of as much of the foul liquid as possible. He gaped in awe at the wall of flesh, at its strangeness. Most of all, though, he examined how the ore vein and the ceiling led right up to it. He told us that he suspected there to be more iron on the other side, so we should continue through it. Mike wasn't doing well ever since his fall. He'd been sick, even going off to vomit a few times. We had to bring in cleavers to work the bottom level. We hauled slabs of meat out in carts. Some of the men apparently saw folks with aprons outside the mine, taking the meat away in burlap sacks on horseback. Rumor was that BT was selling the meat out of town, but nobody was sure where. 3 days in, Mike didn't show up for a head count, and we had to go in and look for him. A couple of the Chinamen found him, curled up in a dead-end tunnel with his belly caved in, his insides puked up in the corner. Long white worms inched about in the pile of guts. I'm good to my friends, but Mike was good to everybody. There wasn't a hewer in that mine who didn't grieve for him. When we went out to tell Big Tom, he was eating a piece of jerky. The bunkhouse was always hard to sleep in, since its foundations creaked at the slightest prompting, and was always somehow 3 times as hot as it was outside. But now it stank of blood and rot as well. Some of us quietly distracted ourselves with theories of the meat's origin, while others pondered the origin of our foreman's snacks. While they distracted us from the heat and smell, neither of these trains of thought arrived at sleep. The next day, while Oysen and I were cleaving into the wall, we saw it shift slightly. We called for the others to come watch it as well, so we could be sure of ourselves. Sure enough, a few minutes later, the meat spasmed. More of us came down to witness what was going on. I hit it with the cleaver to get it to move again. With a great shuddering, the wall of meat moved back. It was too dim to see terribly well, even with our lanterns, but it was clear that the meat was a part of something that had just moved back into a greater cavern. As our eyes adjusted, we could see the gash we made glisten as it swung away, hind legs lifting it up. What was the wall of flesh was now part of some sort of great fleshy abdomen. Dozens of beady eyes glinted in the meager light from our lanterns, all set in a single head that was somewhat flat and ovoid. Long hairs draped from the behemoth's midsection, on the ends of which appeared to be hunks of precious metal. None of us could move. We just stood there and stared, and it stared back. Oysen started to say something, probably in Gaelic, but the second he made the slightest sound, the thing extended a giant clawed forelimb and speared the poor bastard. He screamed as it dragged him away into the dark, moving with an impossible quickness. The metal that its hairs were adorned with bounced and clanked on the rock below as it receded into the abyssal cavern, descending into a pit. Oysen did not stop screaming, though he was carried slowly downward beyond where we could hear him. I had never seen an enclosed space so massive before, or since. We didn't stay long out of fear for our lives, but I'll never forget holding out my lantern, trying to see where the creature went. The pit dropped down into nothing. The walls around us also went up into nothing. The most that we could see were each other's terrified faces. It's possible that there were other cave tunnels connected to that cavern, ones that spanned under people's feet as they walked about town. We forced the way from the mine to that cavern to collapse, doing our best to make sure that nobody would ever encounter whatever that thing was again. We all went to the top level, which we knew full well had no ore. We mined from there so that we could continue the appearance of work, sending rubble out in the carts. We had a new foreman that day, and he didn't ask too many questions about the request for ordnance. Apparently, BT was sick. I could no longer stand to work in that mine, and had to find other honest work out in the open air. Most of the other men did the same. It's been a long while since it happened, but I still sometimes become panicked and dark places.